Explosives Act. It is these two laws which were actually implemented, and child labor almost vanished from the cracker industry, but not from the matchbox industry. So, that shows, as a result of it, adult labor went into the cracker industry and women's minimum wage went up, and when women's minimum wage went up, their children started going to school. So, the role of political will in one context and the role of social will in another, and that is Kerala and Shivakasi. I leave the rest of it for your imagination, but I must say that I pick up the point raised by Sunny, and that is in relation to the age of contract. See, the important thing there really is that an indication to determine what should be the cutoff age? Should it be the age of contract? I suppose in most of our societies 18 is the minimum age of contract. It is not so much the question whether the child who is working has actually entered into a contract or not. That apart, that is important, that has certain value, but can this be the criterion for deciding who is a child and who is not a child? And CRC adopts this criterion. In the CRC it is 18. In India, the Juvenile Justice Act adopts 18 and almost full compliance in that regard. But when it comes to child labor and even the Constitution of India, it refers to age 14. Though the Constituent Assembly debates, in which the founder of the Indian Constitution, Dr. Ambedkar, had many things to say, which I do not have the time to take now, which links up child labor and the age of education. In other words, by that logic, if the Constitution of India were to say that education is guaranteed up to the age of 18, then child labor would also have been 18. Unfortunately, here we have not yet gone to that extent. Even the education law speaks of only age 14. And so, if you accept a new cutoff point, then children, after all, if children must be in a position to complete let us say 12th standard of education, then age 14 is not enough. You will have to move closer to age 18. So, this intricate link between labor and education is very vital, and therefore, if you have a system where all children are sent to school, and if schools begin to function, then you will have a situation similar to Kerala, and that is where the social movements come in. And so, in India there was the campaign against child labor, which brings together 8,000 NGOs, and there was a national campaign for the fundamental right to education, which brought together a similar number, and these two campaigns contributed to the Supreme Court's judgment and later to Article 21A and then to the enactment. So, social movements have made a huge contribution insofar as linking the child labor and education issue is concerned, and the chairperson of NCPCR is a leading example in that regard. The remedies in domestic law in relation to child labor are really weak, but I must say that multinational corporations operating in India, I have visited some of those factories, especially in the garment sector. I have found that they have put up their code of conduct. That was during a period when there was the intense negotiation between the ILO and the WTO, and therefore, there was an attempt to find out whether trade measures can be effectively used in order to achieve some forms of labor rights, and that campaign did pick up quite a lot. But what I found was that campaign was displayed on all notice boards in garment factories, and they said minimum wage must be implemented, hours of work must be implemented, there should be no sexual harassment of women working, and these were all displayed. But what I found to my amazement was the freedom of association was absent from all those lists which were put up as code of conduct. That I thought reflects a certain bias. Even while they want to be child labor friendly, they did not want to recognize the right to form trade unions, and this you might like to examine. I think it has very interesting implications which go beyond what we have talked about. The Clean Clothes campaign has been quite effective in mobilizing public opinion, and it has happened even on the campus in many states in the in USA itself. On re-victimization, just one aspect which struck me, I remember reading this from Corpus Juris Secundum, where in relation to hearsay evidence, the issue is that a very young child speaks to her mother, and I think to the nanny also, explaining the early incident of sexual assault, And then the question was whether the nanny can depose. Technically it would be hearsay evidence, but what the child said was fantastic, and therefore it was allowed. The child said it and the nanny was allowed to depose, and that was, he put his finger there and it hurt. That was the famous statement, and that the court decided must be taken on record even though it is hearsay evidence. So, I think we must keep our minds open to jurisprudence for children which is in complete departure from jurisprudence for adults, and world over there is a strong trend in that direction, and CRC is a useful framework. Even on the right of cross examination, the important thing is that the accused should be able to see the child, but the child need not see the accused. If the child can't see the accused, that does not violate the principle of cross examination. Therefore, if you can have a CCTV arrangement where the accused can see the child deposing and the accused lawyer can be there in real time contact with the lawyer, the accused and the lawyer, that kind of cross examination has been upheld, and I am very keen to know what's the latest position in the United States of America. I read through extensively the federal legislation in this regard and found it very inspiring, and I think I have succeeded in pushing that into the proposed Indian law, which is now likely to come to Parliament. I want to repeat, I was inspired by criminal procedure exceptions and child friendly procedures, especially in the USA and in the UK. UK, it was called special measures, and in the USA those special measures were all picked up and very interestingly codified for federal legislation, and therefore this judgment in one of your states was in relation to videography. So, if it was videography, and if that videographed evidence was to be treated as evidence in chief, examination in chief, and then the question was, will that deprive the right of cross examination? Therefore, when we made the Indian law, said we do not want videography, so that we are not opposed to principles of fair trial, but let us have CCTV so that the technical requirements of cross examination are satisfied. It is an interesting area of jurisprudence. Please explore that, please write about it. It will influence Indian criminal law substantially. Mind you, this is not a juvenile justice issue. This is the child who is facing trial in an adult criminal court, and there you are seeking exemptions from the prevalent Criminal Procedure Code and Evidence Act. Yeah, I think the last one I shall skip to, and that is on the question of breakdown of marriage. Please note that in India you have a Muslim gentleman can say talaq, and that is the end. Probably you can even SMS the word talaq 3 times, and that is the end of the marriage. And at that time, to expect that the child's interest will be taken care of, or it is not just Muslims, let me not create a typology which is injurious. Even among Hindus there can be just desertion. Polygamy among the Hindus is higher by 0.1% than among the Muslims. So, it is not as if it is a personal law problem, but there is prevalence of wide breakdown, and in those cases the law is one thing, the formal law protects the child's rights, and that is true of everything that we have discussed today in India. The formal law is excellent. So, very often lawyers tend to describe the formal law as if that is the reality, but there is such a huge gap when it comes to implementation, and feminist jurisprudence is contributing very substantially. Just now a bill is before Parliament, and that is a bill in order to build one more additional ground for divorce, and that is irreversible breakdown of marriage, and that is an amendment proposed to the Hindu Marriage Act as well as to the Special Marriage Act. In both these cases, the feminist movement has said that should not be allowed unless you recognize the institution of matrimonial property, unless you recognize matrimonial home and matrimonial property, so that the woman can then get justice when there is an irretrievable breakdown. Otherwise, do not allow the law. Some of us support that point of view, and we have mobilized the National Commission for Women in order to take that position, and that work is going on just now. Thank you.